full of rage, striding through the temple courtyard with a whip of cords and telling us all to get out of his father's house. Well, I was outraged at first. Who did he think he was, disrupting our peaceful day? We weren't doing anything unusual, and I was frightened too. He was clearly out of control and violent. So I hid behind one of the colonnades and waited to watch. My father had taken off with all the other stall holders. Suddenly, it all went quiet. Maybe the temple guard had cordoned off the area to keep people safe. And I saw him sit down on one of the steps. It was as though all the energy had gone out of him. The adrenaline had drained away. And he was weeping with his head in his hands. I couldn't help noticing the pigeons set free from their cages. Most of them had flown away, but a small flock were around his feet, scratching in the dirt. Some of them were pecking up bits of old corn that had fallen from the tables. They weren't afraid of him. In fact, several of them flew up onto his shoulder, and one even flew up onto his head. He looked up, smiling, and gently spoke to them and stroked them gently. And that's when I recognised him, that preacher from Nazareth that everyone's been talking about, the one who healed people. Then he moved off, still talking to the birds, and in that moment, I couldn't help feeling sorry for him. He's in terrible trouble. You can't go disturbing the peace like that and get away with it. He's sure to suffer. He left his whip of cords behind. He's sure to suffer far worse.
Did I know him well? Not well, but I knew I could trust him. And for some extraordinary reason, he trusted me. I met him a few times over the years when he and his friends come to Jerusalem over a glass of wine at the edge of crowds. Early on, he looked at me in the eyes and smiled. What a smile. And he greeted me. Shalom, he said. Nothing out of ordinary, except for me. To be greeted at all was extraordinary. Oh, he knew I was a little bit different, shall we say. I mean, how many men do you see carrying water jar with women? But he didn't seem to care, and I loved him for it. I'd have done anything for him. And I offered, because I could see how it was going to go. If ever you and your friends need a safe place to meet, just let me know, and you can come to my place. I'll fix it. And if you can't come yourself, just tell your friends to find me. I'm easy to spot, after all. Even so, the request for the Passover meal came as a bit of shock. I live pretty simply. I rush around, gather things together, swept and tidied. I was so delighted he and his friends would honor me like this. But I have to admit, I was nervous. I've been drawing attention of authorities a bit. And how I was going to provide all his followers. I don't know if the wine is going to stretch, I said to one of them. They looked at my water jar and said, "That jar full of water?" I nodded. Not going to be a problem then, is it? He's done it before, and I winked. So we did it. His follower came with a bunch of women as well. We had the most marvelous time all day, baking and cooking. The aroma of the bread was intoxicating. And then he and his 12 arrived, joking and smiling. No one would have thought they'd know a warrant was out for his arrest. But we all knew, of course. All of us knew. He could turn water into wine, but he couldn't keep himself safe.
Jesus. Love him or hate him. That's what they say. Nothing in between. But me, I loved him and hated him, often on the same day. Oh, I loved him, of course. How could I not? He healed my mother that first day for a start. Sure way to worm his way into my affections. And I'll say this, he never let us go hungry. Not after I told him, it's all very well telling my husband Pete and his brother to up and follow you along the highways and byways, but who's bringing in the money? We've got troubles. We've got mouths to feed, and whenever the coffers were getting a bit low, there'd be another miraculous catch of fish. Nothing miraculous about it, if you ask me. He just had a good eye, and the guys would work 3 times as hard if he asked them. But we all stayed fed. But he was always in trouble. I knew it from the moment I set eyes on him, always whipping up the crowds and annoying the higher-ups. Anyone can see it was dangerous. He could put on a show, I grant you. Amazing storyteller and all that. But it was bound to end badly. I was there that night in the upper room. I'd made the bread. I always make the bread, and it's the lightest in Galilee. Anyone will tell you. So he takes the bread I made, thank you very much, and breaks it and says, "This is my body given to you. Do this in remembrance of me." All very moving. But the next thing, he's scampering off into the night, and my Pete after him. I pulled Pete back. Just for a moment. "You stay out of trouble," I said. "If anything happens, you've never heard of him. Got it?" I should have known better. He says he tried that, and now I've had nothing but let him down. I betrayed him. What does he want? To die like him and leave me a widow and the children without a father? And now, whenever I bake a loaf of bread, all I can see is Jesus' face, smiling gently. Drives me mad.
I knew it was dirty money, of course. Who'd pay 30 pieces of silver for that patch of dirty clay and holes? "We need somewhere to bury the riffraff," they said, all hoity-toity. Maybe, but you wouldn't pay that kind of money, would you? Not unless you had something to hide. So So now I know. That so-called friend of Jesus, Judas, they bought him off. My sister heard about it. Women's talk. Seems Judas was angry because Jesus let some woman cover Jesus with expensive perfume. Sounds fair enough to me. But Judas, well, from what I can gather, he was a bit humorless, bit of a religious zealot. You know the type? Anyway, Judas got all self-righteous. Why was this perfume not sold and given to the poor? And when Jesus didn't fix it, Judas decided to give Jesus over to the authorities. Presumably, Judas thought that he might put the money to a good cause, but betrays Jesus with a kiss of all things. I ask you, how treacherous can you get? But then Judas comes over all regretful and tries to return the money, but all too late. And soon, too late for him, as it turns out. So then the authorities didn't know what to do with the money. Religious people, they don't like to get their hands dirty, do they? Well, not outwardly at any rate. Have to give that Jesus their due. Jesus had the authorities about right, called them whited sepulchres, all show but death dealing in the end. And they certainly dealt out death to Jesus. Never saw much harm in Jesus myself. I don't know what to do with this money now. It's so dirty, I can't hold it. They didn't want it in their precious treasury, and I don't want it either. There's blood all over it. Let earth have it. It's no good to anyone.
I couldn't believe it. All these people who once loved his stories and were always quick enough to ask for his help, baying for his blood. Crucify him, they shouted. And the next minute he was being dragged through the streets like a common criminal to be crucified. That good man, that kind man, who seemed to care for everyone. I'm only a servant girl, but he once told me that he was a servant too, and he helped me carry my heavy burden. I tore at my clothes, and the tears streamed down my face. I couldn't help it. It was like all the grief and all the trauma from these years of occupation came flooding out. But I wasn't on my own. A whole crowd of us started following him up the street, calling out, trying to encourage him, weeping for him. We were being crushed by the crowd. It was hard to keep up, but we elbowed our way through and we got to him. And the two criminals that were being pushed along the road with him. And he called out to us in the midst of his own pain. He was trying to warn us, telling us not to weep for him, but to weep for the times to come. The times when there would be more suffering, more starvation, more horror. We couldn't bear it. The suffering we were seeing in front of us was enough. He was so weak. They must have flogged half of his blood out of him. And he kept falling over. In the end, they bullied some poor bloke from the country into helping carry the crossbeam. I reached out and he touched my scarf. It was only for an instant, but I feel it will bear the imprint of his love and his suffering forever. I didn't keep watching. Some of the others kept going, but I fell back. The weight of it all was just too much. I will never forget his fingers reaching out, the tenderness, the touch.
It should have been just a regular day for us. Flog the ones to be flogged, crucify the ones to be crucified, share the pickings, play dice while they die, throw the bodies in the common grave. I never look at them. A job's a job after all. I never listen either. Too many last requests, screams and cries have to stop my ears. But that day was different. That guy was different. He hardly said a word. But when he spoke, it was powerful, considered. Not the words of a dying man. And he never moved, never flinched, even when the nails went in. How's that possible? It's the stillness I remember, as though he was the still point around which everything else turned. And then the women. I remember the women. I never noticed wailing women near the crosses. There are always women there wailing, lamenting some father or lover or child. Sometimes we have to hold them back, drive them away. But this group was different. They never moved or spoke. They just stood there, watching and waiting for death. But it was as though they waited for something else, not an end, but some kind of beginning. I remember the darkness too. No sun, even at noon. And the birds stopped singing, as though the very earth held its breath. And then he cried out, not in despair, but in triumph. It is finished. And he breathed his last, not a gasp, but a slow exhalation, a benediction. And since then, I can't do it anymore. I don't know what I'll do, but no more crucifixions for me.
I'm Salome, mother of the sons of Zebedee. Yes, that's right. The one that asked that really stupid question. Can my boys sit at your right and left hand? Even as the words came out of my mouth, I knew I shouldn't have spoken. But Jesus was always kind. You just don't know what you're asking, he said. Can you drink the cup I'm about to drink? He asked. And we said yes. But we had no idea, absolutely no idea. But when we stood there and watched him die, his mother, Mary Magdalene, and the other Mary, then we began to understand. Sometimes there's no way out but through. Sometimes we have to let it all go. Every last vestige of power or control. Sometimes you just have to be there, nothing more, and that's enough. So now, as we struggle on through the miasma of grief and loss, sometimes we catch a glimpse and we remember. When we cast the nets and drag in the fish, we remember. When we tell the stories and sing the songs,
We
we
remember.
When we struggle and shoulder the burdens and wash the feet, we remember. When we cry out for justice and stand with the oppressed, we remember. When we break the bread and drink the wine, we remember. And every time we remember, Christ lives among us and love triumphs once again.